Would you both comment on the historiography of the war? Now, I joked at the beginning that you haven't caught up with the Civil War yet, and there's 60,000 plus. I think 60,000 are coming out every month today during the Bicentennial. But here we are with an 1860 book by McAfee, an early book on the war. How has historiography kind of briefly progressed from 1816 and McAfee to today, and do we see any shift in how the war is looked at, and how many books do you think there are out there on the war? A lot of questions there.
This is one of the great classics on the war in the Old Northwest, still useful today. Most of what appeared during or shortly after the war, unless it included documents, probably isn't very valuable today. And you look at the histories written for the rest of the 19th century, most of them are myth-building, patriotic, and therefore unreliable treatments of the war. The serious historiography begins probably with Henry Adams, his multi-volume history of the presidencies of Jefferson and Madison. First, his 9-volume work was first published in 1889, 1891, and that is arguably the first modern history of the War of 1812. Now, there's been a ton written on the war. There was a book published back in the mid-'80s, long before the recent spate of works on the war, and it's a book-length list of books and articles on the War of 1812. So we have plenty that's been written on the war, although I still think it's a forgotten conflict.
Is Glenn Tucker's book any good still, the 2-volume?
It is. He has a great appendix on some of the military practices and weapons.
Okay.
But I would say Poltroons and Patriots,
Yes.
that he co-wrote with the military historian, James R. Jacobs. I think that's a neat little, it's not a little, a neat work, and I still sometimes refer to it.
Yeah, they also have nice dust jackets. And by the way, most of these things that we're talking about here, for you buffs out there, these things are for sale here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. That's how we keep ourselves going and get more in, and we have real artifacts that you could enjoy at home.
If I could say a word about McAfee, too, which
Please.
is a particular favorite of mine. McAfee had been an officer in the war, served under Richard Mentor Johnson and William Henry Harrison. He was a Kentuckian. And I don't know very much about his background, perhaps you do in terms of education or training. But he went back home in 1816 and wrote what is, for its time and place, really a marvelous story. He'd had personal knowledge of many of the events. But ironically, and it's pointed out in his foreword, he had written to the governors of Illinois, particularly Indian Edwards, asking for information on the war in the Illinois and Missouri theaters. And his preface says that he'd received the documents too late, but that he would incorporate them into a second edition if one was offered. No one, it never reached the second edition, and no one else took up the challenge until my own book, other than a long article in 1904. So we had a chance with McAfee to have really a very, very good and reasonably reliable contemporary history of war in this theater, but we didn't. He does have 3 pages on the Fort Dearborn Massacre. He had served with a survivor of the Fort Dearborn Massacre, Sergeant William Griffith, who was his source of information on that. And there are, unfortunately, just about 3 pages on it, but it's full of interest because it came to a reasonably reliable historian, if not a scientific one, from the lips of someone who was there.
Well, as I'm fond of saying, and everyone in this room has probably heard at least 3 times before, that first editions aren't scarce, second editions are.
Case in point.
Here is, I'm going to show these 2 illustrations right here. One's kind of to an American and another to the British. Let's talk a bit about the illustrations, which are worth this book alone, are the illustrations, frankly. For me, I love them. What role did imagery and iconography play in the public perception of that war? Did it help convince Americans and Canadians and British that their side was winning?
Yes. There's an old saw on the outcome of this war, that everybody's happy with the result. Americans are happy because they think they won. The Canadians are happier because they know they won. And the British are happiest of all because they've forgotten all about it. And I think that's a fair assessment, although it ignores the biggest losers, which were the Indians. But after the war, Americans were very, very good at using images to sort of promote how they wanted to remember the war. And the way they remembered the war was very different from the way the war was waged. And the real game changer there was the Battle of New Orleans. After the Battle of New Orleans, Americans forgot the cause of the war. They forgot how close we'd come to military defeat and financial collapse. All they remembered was how we had single-handedly defeated the conquerors of Europe at New Orleans.
I compare this sometimes to the old boxing movie Rocky. And I take a somewhat different view, which is in which a unknown amateur fighter challenges the heavyweight champion of the world, and he loses. But at the end of the 15th round, when the final bell rings, he's still on his feet, throwing punches, giving as good as he got. And I think to some extent the United States can look back on that as a sort of a Rocky moment. Yes, we lost the fight in a sense, but for the first time the United States really showed that it was a nation which had to be reckoned with and whose rights had to be respected, because it would, at some point, if pushed far enough, fight.
I think that's a fair assessment. In that sense, it did vindicate American sovereignty, and in a kind of broad sense, you can argue that, okay, we did win the war. But that's in a very sort of broad metaphysical sense. But that illustrates another point. The legacy of this war, maybe the forgotten conflict, but the legacy of this war was profound. And the more I study it, the more I realize it just reverberates through the 19th century in a host of different ways. You just look at the people who dominated the American political and military establishment up to the Civil War. Most of them launched their careers during the War of 1812, and that's what made them men to be reckoned with in public life or in military life.
We're going to go into some of those people. Connie, I want to ask you, here is one wonderful print. I just love this one. I've not seen that before. And could you tell us where, now this one, let me make sure, do you remember what this is? Because I don't. I loved it the other night. Published in 1813, showing the aftermath of the victory, the Anglo-Indian victory at Frenchtown. And Brigadier General was taken, James Winchester was taken, and his clothing was taken, his sword was taken, and presented to an embarrassed General Proctor, right? With a painted torso that the Indians had done. Where did you find most of your illustrations, and did you find some that had not been seen? And
yes,
tell us about the illustrations a bit, please.
Out of sheer necessity, we found them in a lot of public domain, just in old editions, and trying to find the original source so that we could affordably put them in the book.
Did you have to leave some out?
Yes. Actually, it kills me, the number of illustrations that aren't in there.
And every time we see a new one, we say, oh, if only we'd included that.
Yeah.
Now, Johns Hopkins did a fabulous job of supporting the production of this book, but we had a fixed budget, $1,000 for all of our images, and there may be 150 in there. Now, normally, if you're buying them from depositories, that's 10 pictures. That's not an illustrated history. So Connie made it her mission to find images, especially rare ones, useful ones, compelling ones, powerful ones, that were in the public domain, and she did a great job.
Oh, positively. I would tell you that's the case. Here's one I'm going to show now that I really love too. This is a long one. The camera will have to pan over it, but tell us a bit about this, and certainly this is an early version of Uncle Sam, you know?
Well, until recently, this used to be thought the first reference to Uncle Sam for the U.S. government or the United States or the Army. In fact, I found an earlier reference, maybe 4 or 5 months earlier, but this is a broadside. It was issued in eastern New York in the spring of 1813, and it has some doggerel in it, and it refers to the United States as Uncle Sam. So an early use of that nickname for the United States. It actually became fairly common during the war. Often it was referred to the U.S. Army, and typically it was a pejorative use, until by the end of the war, I think it had become a little more positive.
Let's talk about some of the people who came out of the war. I'm going to give you one right here that is a powerful image that's also in your book. And here we are with Andrew Jackson in an anti-Andrew Jackson print, broadside, in the 1828 presidential campaign, and showing coffins and harkening back right to our war. How did this come about?
Well, Jackson, one of the reasons he was such an effective general is his men hated him, or feared him, I should say, more than they feared the enemy. And that was because of his iron discipline, as well as his own example, being able to put up with anything. Dysentery, it wrecked him on the campaign trail. It didn't slow him down a bit. But anyway, he had a group of West Tennessee militia who left camp convinced that their term of service was up in early 1814. They later came back. He rounded up the ringleaders, tried and convicted 6 of them on various charges, mutiny and desertion, and they were executed. They were actually executed after it was generally thought the war was probably over, although Jackson hadn't received official notice. So he certainly could have suspended that sentence pending official notification, but he carried it out. Those 6 guys were executed, and his enemies never let him forget his harsh brand of military justice, and they used that against him in the election of 1828, although it didn't work.
No, it didn't. But, the numbers of people that come through your books, both of your books, we have Sam Houston, Andrew Jackson, Davy Crockett, Zachary Taylor, Winfield Scott, Zebulon Pike, William Henry Harrison, Henry Dearborn, people who we know. Black Hawk, who was my favorite, and himself, I could say, started Abraham Lincoln's career. We have Knitting Edwards and Black Hawk in here, both connected to Lincoln in the 1832 campaign, 3 months of a non-war, really. So there are many of those people in your books that everyone reading them are going to have to get into. There's so much to say about all of them. But are there some unsung heroes of the conflict that we don't know about, or here in the Illinois territory, or generally in any of the theaters? One or two that we don't know about that will be in the book that we should hear about.
Well, I've mentioned Edwards, definitely unsung. In fact, maybe the opposite. But one that I learned about as I began doing the research, and to me, kind of a hero is Domo, who is the principal chief of the Potawatomi Indians on the Illinois River. And as such, he was really only first among equals. He didn't have power to command, but the Indians generally looked to him as their spokesman in dealings with the Americans. Domo is one of the few Indians for whom were able to there's sufficient material to get some sort of idea of the shape of his mind and what his wishes were, largely because he was spokesman at so many Indian conferences. Though Domo was, I always say, a born diplomat. The preferred route between 2 points was never a straight line for him. But he was always concerned to keep his people from disaster and resisted the calls of the war party as long as he could, was eventually dragged into the war and led 1 or 2 rather interesting war parties. But more than anyone perhaps that I encountered in my book, he seems to have had some sense of the fact that eventually the killing was going to stop and we were all going to have to find a way to live together. Sadly, he died about the end of the conflict in 1815, and even more sad is that he's commemorated in the state where he lived only by the name of a single street, which is about 2 blocks long in Peoria, in the projects there. There is, I understand, some interest in a memorial to him, but he hasn't received it yet and certainly deserves to be better remembered.
I published a book in 2006, which you guys have here, called Don't Give Up the Ship, which is on the mythology of the war. And I have a little section there where I tried to identify several unsung heroes on both sides. The guy on the other side that I picked was a Mohawk Indian leader named John Norton. And as we speak, the Canadians today are deciding maybe he should be elevated to the pantheon of Canadian heroes. My own take is that he was more significant than the Great Tecumseh, because he was in a more important theater of operations, the Niagara frontier. On the American side, I had a public service servant in Detroit, a guy named Woodward, who remained after all the other government officials had left during the British occupation, and really served as a liaison between British officials and the French-American population there at Detroit, and they really appreciated the services that he performed as a liaison.
Judge Woodward, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Who was he was instrumental, I guess, in trying to identify the survivors of the Fort Dearborn Massacre here in Chicago. And
I think yeah.
came up with the first really list of the survivors, which he gave to Proctor, and so did his help. And so we remember him here in Chicago as well.
Okay. Well, interestingly, he got along famously with Proctor until early 1813, when news filtered up to Detroit of the River Raisin Massacre, which came right after the Battle of Frenchtown, featured in that one image you showed. And he suggested that Proctor was culpable because he had withdrawn with the walking wounded and not left the other wounded adequately protected from the Indians. And boy, Proctor got really furious at this hint that he was responsible for the River Raisin Massacre. And shortly thereafter, Woodward left and went to Washington to tell his story there.